take a couple bags and give it a shot. I mean, they're free, and if they don't work, they don't work. You can read about online. They have to be cold treated for a little bit, and then you can do it in different ways, and then they're good to go. I don't have a lot of purple milkweed in the yard, so it's fun to have this to try out and see what works and doesn't. And I'm going to go ahead and introduce our speaker. I get the privilege to do that, and I'm going to have to read a little bit because even though I've known Sean for a couple of years, we never met. How does that happen? Because there's a pandemic and we only met online, like so many of us had to do over the years. So, so we've met having meetings, the lovely meetings on either Zoom or Teams. And anyway, so it was through one of those meetings that I had the idea to have him come speak to our group. Sean has spent the last 3.5 years serving as he's the Land Stewardship Program Manager. So it's with Raleigh Parks and Rec. What is the full name now of Raleigh Parks and Rec?
Raleigh Parks, Rec, and Culture.
Raleigh Parks, Rec, and Culture. So, and previously he was a regional biologist for North Carolina State Parks, and environmental specialist with the North Carolina Soil and Water Conservation Division. In those positions, he spent time working with large parks or larger properties, parks, preserves, other natural areas, and those are hundreds of acres or more. In the current position, he's doing land management, strategizing, but these are smaller areas, smaller parks, smaller, just less acreage, and learning how to, adapt the kind of stuff that he does in these systems that preserves the greenways in an urban landscape. And as he said, the transition has provided numerous challenges, as I'm sure it has, and also, along with some pleasant surprises, and just understanding the real value of having our parks and our open spaces here in this urban setting. So we asked him to talk about just, how does someone like Sean, how does he do what he does within the park system to help preserve the biodiversity that we see in our area? So that means inventory and folks like us that go out and do this stuff and report it, they often go out and get those reports and bring it into their database system and then work with it. So we play a part in doing that. So, he's going to talk about what more we can do to help out groups like Wake Audubon while we're out there doing what we do. So with that, Sean, take it away. I'll do the lights.
All right, let me get this all set up. All right, if I can hide this little bit. Nope, I've got to do this again. They taught me earlier how to do this. There we go. Maybe I can hide. There it is. All right. All right. We're good with the lights. I'll go ahead and jump in. I want to thank John, first of all, for sending the invitation for me to come and speak with you guys tonight. Thank Wake Audubon as a whole for having me as a guest, and to everybody here in the room and everybody out in TV land that's taking time out of their evening to come and hear me talk about different ways we like to try and sometimes succeed in documenting the different levels of biodiversity that are found within the Raleigh Park system. As John mentioned in the bio, it's been kind of a culture shock over the last 3 years, roughly, with me coming in and learning how to manage natural resources in an urban environment as opposed to something that's a little larger. Natural processes are a little more intact, a lot more room for habitat patch size and different species, different suites. So it's not without its own challenges, but I find it rewarding in that every parcel is 10 times more valuable on this landscape than it would be in the middle of nowhere. So every effort we make, I believe, is magnified. One of the things we really are trying to step up our efforts in is documenting what we have through ecological monitoring and different inventory efforts. That's not only in parks. I think that's often a misnomer when we talk about Raleigh Parks, but it includes our nature preserves, our greenways, and our other open spaces. And we try our best to understand what types of species, both flora and fauna, are using these areas and what we can do to help improve them, protect them, conserve them, and also balance the human element, allowing access to high quality examples of natural areas for people to come and view and enjoy. It's often difficult to strike that balance, but it's something that we work with every day. So hopefully, maybe, there we go. Quick outline of what we're going to talk about tonight. I want to introduce you to the natural resources team. We as in Raleigh Parks recently underwent a reorganization at the beginning of this year. The natural resources unit was housed kind of in its own section, and now we've been tied in with the parks operations group, which is really beneficial because they have all the toys that we want to play with. They have all the land management capabilities, the equipment that we need if we're doing something a little bit more large scale. But the natural resources team themselves is a unique group of people within the park system, and we're going to talk a little bit more about them. We're going to jump into the different habitat patches and corridors that we manage. Why are those important? We're going to talk about biological monitoring and inventories more in the broad sense, and how that in turn informs the next bullet, which is our habitat management strategies. We'll get more specifics on the different monitoring and inventory strategies we use. And fair warning, John told me it was okay that if we cover different taxa, and not just birds, we are going to have some bird focus, but there's going to be kind of an overall look at biodiversity in general and some of the things we found. We'll talk about partnerships. Partnerships are super important for folks like us. Thank you. All right. Where we may not have the capacity and capability to go out and monitor and inventory the amount of area that we really need to in order to keep a pulse on how things are progressing. Raleigh, as you know, is developing extremely rapidly. I heard something like 16 people a day move to the Triangle area. We're due to double the population, I think, in 20 years. So now is as critical as ever is getting out there and getting a grasp on what we have currently and what we can do to protect and preserve those. We'll talk about different collective action initiatives that the city of Raleigh and Raleigh Parks is already a part of. And we'll round out with different elements, different items that you can do to help us on our mission, both as a group, as Wake Audubon, and individually as just citizens of Raleigh. All right, so this is our natural resources team. It's broken up by site. As you can see, there's Durant and Horseshoe nature preserves. There's Walnut Creek Wetland Park, and in the bottom right, there's Annie Louise Wilkerson Preserve. So this staff that is part of our natural resources team not only runs these facilities, but they're also brought on board because they have certain expertise or background knowledge in different natural resource management elements. We also have 2 programs underneath the resources team. I'm sorry, 3 programs. There's a nature preserves program at the top. That's Christy Moyer. She kind of manages the staff that is site specific. And then we have the environmental education program, and then my program, the Land Stewardship Program, which up until 2 weeks ago was just myself. I'm happy to announce that we have hired a new person. That's Cody Coates down in the bottom there. He's going to be our new invasive species program coordinator. Comes to us all the way from sunny Florida. We were able to pull him up here. Worked for the water management districts down there. Has a lot of good aquatic knowledge, which is something we're lacking. So we're excited about having him on board. We also have a couple of part-time positions we're going to hire under my program. So we are gradually expanding our workforce. It's been a little, lonesome at times in my program, but now we're actually moving in the right direction, I hope. All right, so habitat patches, wildlife corridors. I like to think of the parks and the preserves and the greenways that we manage less so as the human, the element that's related to human use or community use. So greenways is a transportation and recreation avenue. Parks and preserves is places you can come out and walk your dog, maybe play in a playground, have a picnic. I like to think of all that other stuff. That's where the habitat lies. And so we manage our parks and preserves more like habitat patches in our greenways, utility right-of-ways, riparian buffers, or our corridors that help connect these patches. We try our best to keep an eye on that connection, especially because that's the only way any sort of dispersal, whether that's flora or fauna, can happen in an urban environment like this. Stormwater can disperse things, but typically that's the things you don't want. But if we don't have some sort of connection, it's very difficult for different species to propagate and to spread and to persist. The protection of these habitat patches and these corridors and the improvement of them is one of the greatest ecological services we as Raleigh Parks really provides to the city, in my opinion, because that's something that goes underappreciated, I feel like, but that's okay, because I think the overall satisfaction is making sure that we're doing our best to maintain these connections and these habitats for best use. All right, biological monitoring and inventory, which is kind of loosely what this talk tonight is based on. I don't have to tell this group who's keenly aware, I'm sure, of the value of going out and gathering biological data. It's critical to know what we have in order to make management plans and to prescribe management actions in order to help preserve and protect and improve those habitats. We try our best to identify any rare or protected species with a more recently a focus on what we're calling locally rare or uncommon. So these are the plants and animals that may have strong populations outside of the city, but once you come into this landscape, all of a sudden that habitat need or whatever that resource need is no longer available. I think of the salamanders that we've worked with John several times. And although if you go outside the city, you can find them abundantly, once you come inside the city, it's difficult to find them. So, and becoming increasingly more so. So being able to not only look at those that are already in that need of greatest conservation, but those that are quickly approaching that is important. We look at historic inventories. We try to go back and see what was there before. Maybe if there was something that happened or something that was altered, maybe that can inform us as to why that may or may not be there anymore. And then we try to look at the different types of species, the number of species, the seasonality in which they use these habitats and corridors, and the amount, the level of use. That all helps guide our management actions and points priorities for us in terms of where we need to concentrate actions. How can we do that unless we're monitoring and inventorying constantly and doing more so than we have in the past? I like to explain to people when I talk about wildlife management, they often think that we're out there, physically manipulating animals, wrestling bears, or bringing in, yanking beavers out or something like that. But it's wildlife management, at least in our purview, is habitat management. We try to create the habitat. We try to improve the habitat based on what we know are suitable needs of certain species or different groups of species. Again, we try to make sure that habitat patches have some type of connection, whether that's a riparian buffer, a utility right-of-way, a greenway easement. We develop management plans of different scopes that prescribe actions in order to help improve those areas. And we are constantly doing our best to influence city planning and zoning decisions to help us in the long run. So one of the things I'd like to take at least a minute to dwell on, and Mary Abrams, I can thank especially for this. We are finally moving towards adopting some type of native plant requirement or do not plant list for city properties. Now, that was something that gained a lot of momentum within Raleigh Parks, but now we have stormwater, we have Raleigh water, we have urban forestry, we have planning, we have so many more people who have now signed on. We're hammering out the language, we're hammering out the logistics. It may originally only apply to city-owned properties or properties with some sort of city interest, but eventually, hopefully, will be adopted into the larger municipal code and the development ordinances that will prevent that from happening in the future. So we're not shooting ourselves in the foot constantly, whereas we're treating invasives on one hand and then we're planting them on the other hand.
And while Sean takes a sip of his drink, he's doing all this work. Let's talk about it. He's doing the work.
Well, Barry provided examples from other municipalities where they had success doing that. And that was a big lift for us because I don't know how many of y'all have worked in government or bureaucracies. A lot of times it's your voice is not as loud as somebody else from outside, right? So if you need that additional traction, that's where groups like Wake Audubon really come in handy. The good old Field of Dreams cliche, if you build it, they will come. That's the idea. It's not guaranteed. In order to make sure that anything is happening at all, you need to be able to monitor. When we do some sort of monitoring and we have informed management prescriptions, typically these are the broad buckets we can look at what we're doing. A lot of what we do for habitat management revolves around vegetation management, whether that's native or non-native plants. We'll talk about that a little bit more on the next slide. Something we're excited about and something we've been dabbling in a lot more is prescribed fire. We've had several burns over the last couple of years with some really cool results, and we'll get into that on a couple slides from now. Non-native invasive wildlife. This is something that's kind of new, and for now is really more focused on forest pest. So emerald ash borer has been a huge issue. We're doing our best to try to maintain and count our ash trees where they are still standing. We even did a little bit of treatment over at Horseshoe Farm as an experimental to see how the imamectin benzoate, so it's the non-neonicotinoid alternative to treating for emerald ash borer, and results are great so far. So we do hydrological restoration where it's appropriate, where it's feasible. And overall, we have 10,000 acres and I think over 24 miles of greenway. We can't manage it all. We can't help improve it all at the same time. So at the very least, our basic principle is to preserve and to protect these areas from development and from further degradation so that they continue to be used for habitat and for corridors. All right, vegetation management. Obviously, one of the first stops is it a native plant? Is it non-native? If it's a native plant, is it something that's rare? Is it something that's protected? Is it something that we've identified as being locally rare? We usually start with mechanical control, whether that's a mowing or cutting, disking, weeding. That usually sets us up for some other management practice, whether that's prescribed fire or chemical control in some cases. When we do use herbicides, we don't typically use pesticides except for that example of the ash borer. Most of the times we're using herbicides, but we're doing it in a safe, effective, and responsible way. We're trying our best to identify the selective herbicides, very narrow spectrum. We're going to apply them at the lowest rate we can to still achieve efficacy. And we're going to do them in very targeted application techniques. So as you can see in the upper right-hand corner, things like herbicide dauber bottles are super handy for that. Lastly, if we need to supplement native vegetation, we'll come in and we'll plant grasses, we'll plant shrubs and trees. We typically look for those that aren't ornamental, but those that have more of a wildlife benefit. So whether it's something that's mass producing, something that provides winter cover, or something that may have a specific host relationship with insects or birds or pollinator relationship. So that's typically what we do in terms of vegetation management. On top of prescribed fire, which let's see if I can get this right. Earlier this year, we were able to do 2 burns. Both of those were at Wilkerson Nature Preserve. At the beginning of 2022, we were able to do 3 burns, 2 at Wilkerson, 1 at Lake Johnson. And then prior to that, 2017 was the last time they burned a small piece at Wilkerson again. I don't think I have to explain to this group, but I typically like to cover it. Fire was once a huge influential force on the landscape. It helped shape our ecosystems in the Southeast United States. As you can see on this fire prevalence map, the darker the orange and red, the more frequent the fire return intervals were. And we're in an area where we would have been roughly on like a 3 to 5, 3 to 7. But that's a debate for another day. Fire scientists can get into it pretty easily with them. We know we need fire. We know we have ecosystems that would respond to fire and have not, have been fire excluded for a long time. We know it aids in the vegetation management that we're working on, the nutrient cycling and succession. And we always make sure whenever we're implementing burns, just like with the chemical control, safety is our highest priority. We're always monitoring weather and fuel conditions to make sure we have the right window to achieve the effects we need. And our fire control lines are usually more robust than we need them. But if we're burning right near I-40, or if we're burning right near a subdivision with multi-million-dollar homes, it makes me feel better to have an extra little bit of width on those control lines. One neat story I'd like to share is from Wilkerson. And I know several people are probably familiar with this story, but again, I like to tell it because it's a cool story. We did a couple burns, and in the bottom right-hand corner, that's actually the plot where we were burning at Wilkerson. It's a very small area. It's 3/10 of an acre right near the visitor center. If you go out there now, you'll see it's got this fence all the way around it. It's got some signage out in front of it. After 2 burns, Brian England, the site manager there, who is a botanist extraordinaire, was able to go out doing routine monitoring that he had set up and discovered a plant that hadn't been seen in North Carolina in 50 years. I'm not the best plant expert, but to me, that is mind-boggling. It's redwood lettuce is the common name. Latuca hirsuta, I believe, I can check that, is the Latin binomial. So it's something that we knew it was around. We don't know how many people are actually out there looking for it, but the last record of it was 50 years ago. And we were able to wake this thing up with just a couple of prescribed burns on a really small area So imagine what we could do if we expanded those efforts over 10,000 acres, what else we might find. All right, so now I want to get more into what are some of the monitoring strategies that we're actively employing, and maybe how would we like to increase these as we go forward, and with some help from partners and folks like you. Camera traps are obviously a really fun, economical way to study. We can put them in a lot of different areas. We're really increasing our usage across parks, and we're trying to monitor wildlife corridors a little better, because we really need to see how well those are being used. Once we have certain images like the ones I'm getting ready to show you, it's really easy to walk to a city council meeting and show these images and say, this is really important to protect, and this is why. If we came in with just a map and a green strip in the middle, it doesn't really have the same impact. So using these to help us not only gather inventory, but to capture really useful images is something that we've learned can be useful. So we're purchasing more cameras. We're trying to get them implemented more across the city. Obviously, it's great for macro fauna, the bigger things that you can observe, mammals, sometimes some birds, and provide some good volunteer and citizen science opportunities where we can have volunteers going out and checking traps, even implementing traps, or purchasing their own, putting them up on their property, and then reporting to us what they find. Any data is good data. We have different buckets we can sort it in, but we won't know it's there if we don't have eyes in as many places as we can. So I'm excited about this initiative because it's something we're starting to use a lot more of. And we find cool stuff like this. You know, we have wood ducks up in the upper left, pretty sizable bobcat in the upper right. That was at Walnut Creek Wetland Center on the Greenway. So that's inside the Beltline. Beavers here, I believe this was also at Walnut Creek. It's really useful to monitor for beavers to see what sort of activity, because you know their impact potentially on other systems within that environment. We do catch a lot of deer, and if you talk to anybody who has a trail cam, you get a lot of complaints about deer because that's all they ever see. It's deer or squirrel or rabbit. But for us, it's really useful to be able to identify not only where deer are coming in and out of a property, where are they foraging, but are we getting fawns? Are we getting does? Are we getting bucks? Where are they, concentrated at what times of year? So that really helps us, because deer browse is a huge issue. It's a huge pressure in a lot of our parks. So knowing where deer are and how they're using the property can only help us in the future protect different plants that are currently getting hammered by the overpopulated deer in this area. So hopefully these videos play. Yeah. This is the family of river otters, Walnut Creek, again, so inside the Beltline. Really cool stuff that you wouldn't expect. This is a pretty photogenic group. They have other videos and more still shots of them coming up and looking at the camera and bouncing around, but they've been there for several years. So they're persisting. It's not a huge area. It's not a huge habitat patch, but they found a place that they like. And so far, we've been able to keep them around. Here's another video. I want to preface this with a little bit of a warning. It's a little graphic. This is a video of a mink, which I've seen several videos of minks. This is the best video of a wild mink I've ever seen. He's carrying a rabbit that he just killed, and this is at Durant Nature Preserve. And while this isn't a trail camera, this is a visitor to the park recorded this and sent it to us. We would have never known. This is like 1:30 in the afternoon. Very strange. And this is neat. Hopefully it doesn't cut off before. See him dip under the bank. And so we're assuming he either has a little refugia under there, or maybe even a den. This was several months ago, so we're not sure. But we have trail cameras out there now, because we know that this is where activity is happening. So we'll see what else we can find. I'm sorry. Oh, no, that was Durant Nature Preserve. Yes, ma'am. Yep. That was right off. If you come in on the entrance off of Camp Durant Road, as you're crossing into the park, there's the stream that runs parallel to the Greenway. If you were to head left from the entrance, a couple 100 feet right down there. So it was a really nice day. It was a pretty busy time. So there were other people around, and he didn't seem to notice anybody. So, John had mentioned earlier, the pleasant surprises, those are all really, really neat. And again, really useful to take to different meetings and to different advocacy or, where you're trying to make a point of the value of these things. And that's so much more impactful. We do have expanded our avian monitoring efforts. We have set up point count grids in a lot of different areas. Although you notice that that's not exactly a grid. We had to shift some points to account for, where things fell. But Horseshoe Farm, Durant Nature Preserve, Wilkerson Nature Preserve, Walnut Creek, Lake Johnson, Lake Wheeler. So we're trying to scatter them around where we have coordinated counts that are conducted at least 2 to 4 times a year, depending on what the staff there can do, depending on their knowledge and background too of ID. We may be more impactful as we are working on developing a set of standard guidelines or protocols for monitoring birds, not just birds, but other species that we'll share with our staff throughout. So even if we have community center folks who don't have a strong natural resources background, we can create a document that's simple enough for them to be able to implement photo points or bird count surveys or transect lines, different things like that, just to expand the amount that we're actually getting out and looking. John mentioned earlier, eBird and iNaturalist observations. We're constantly going and gleaning information from those, especially if it's in preparation for creating some sort of report or management plan for a property. Bird banding, something that we were really excited about a year and a half ago, and then our experienced bander left us to go to another job. And so we kind of put that on ice, although I've got the budget for it. We just need some folks that can help us with that and help us identify folks with the permits that we can then band under, or, maybe help at least a staff member or two get that experience that they need. But I imagine there's got to be somebody out there studying urban bird populations and impacts, because that to me would be really, really interesting to see how that differs. Again, another opportunity for volunteer and community science work. We are looking at pollinator insects too. That's something that's getting a lot more traction these days. The city of Raleigh is committed to establishing more pollinator habitat over time. They're part of initiatives like Bee City USA. We have several monarch way stations set up. One of the coolest things to me is that we're reducing a lot of the regularly mowed areas. So areas that are mowed once every 2 weeks during the growing season are now being taken at a mowing rotation and maybe mowed once a year, are allowed to grow up for the first 2 to 3 years, and then we'll come in and we'll mow them. Some of them will shape a little more than others. Some of them we may seed or supplement vegetation. Others we're just allowing to revegetate naturally, as long as they don't come back with a bunch of invasives. But we've been able to do that in several places, not only in big patches in different parks, but also along greenways. So we're reducing mowing, we're increasing pollinator plants. We don't have a lot of inventory in terms of insect populations. It's something we'd really like to get more help on. There are obvious educational needs, not only for the public in terms of identifying and logging and monitoring insects, but also for us in Raleigh Parks. So we are looking to different folks. We worked with somebody from NC State recently to come and teach our staff a little bit more about how to collect and to monitor and to identify different insects. Again, volunteer community science opportunities. There's a trend there. Reptiles, amphibians, fish, and other aquatic fauna. I didn't want to leave them out, but we haven't done nearly as much as we could. These are two frontiers where we'd like to do a lot more. We know we have a lot of really neat salamanders in several spots, including this northern red salamander that Alvin Braswell found at the Neuse River Park a month or two months ago. So that's another one of those, from what I understand, and somebody who's better with herps can correct me, is if you were to go outside the city, you wouldn't have too much trouble finding one, but inside the city is something that's really not very common. So similar in other initiatives, we're going to try to increase the amount of trapping we're doing. We've purchased some turtle traps. We've purchased some minnow traps to try to catch some salamanders. We are looking at setting up internal trainings and workshops. We had Thomas Reed from Wake County Open Spaces come out and do a workshop with us last year. More collaboration with partners. The same thing with fish and other aquatic fauna. There's just a big knowledge gap in terms of what we have in our staff. So we're looking to partners. We're looking to North Carolina Wildlife Resources in the past to come out and help us do some sampling. Again, we'd like to do more workshops and trainings. And just like with Cody Coates, we're looking for candidates now who have a broader knowledge of not just terrestrial systems, but aquatic systems as well. Our partnerships are, we live and die by our partnerships. You know, our external partnerships are fantastic, but internally now we have to work with a lot of other city departments. So Raleigh Water, Public Utilities, Transportation. We're getting better at doing that internally, and we've made some serious strides, like with the native plant requirement. But NC State, Wildlife Resources, Audubon Society, the museum, Wake Nature has been a huge help. So all these folks we look to, and I've left off several more, but these are the folks we typically turn to when we say we have an idea, we need help with this. And 9 times out of 10, they're able to help us either provide expertise or just general guidance, different resources that we can use to collect more inventory data and to continue to manage the parks and preserves a little bit better. One of the partnerships proved to be super helpful. That was with NC State. So every spring semester, although I don't know if it's going to continue because I think Dr. George Hess is doing less in terms of class load. But every spring semester, Dr. George Hess from NC State would bring his field measurements class out to a Raleigh Parks property, and they would do different types of monitoring. So some groups would be looking at birds, some groups would be looking for herps, some would be looking for unauthorized access or use, some would be looking for a litter, and they would do in smaller groups, collect this data, put it in a nice report and get it back to us. And we have gotten some really good results from them over the years, but probably nothing more important than this one. I want to say 2018, 2017, we had his group out to the Pearl Road property. Pearl Creek is another name for it, although with the tributary there is unnamed. They were out there just doing regular monitoring. I'm not sure what this group is looking for specifically. I think maybe they were the invasive plant group. And they came across a really small, interesting looking worm-like fish in the stream. They didn't know what it was. This is the actual video they took that day of it. And if you listen at the end, it's kind of funny.
Yeah.
Okay, so you couldn't really hear him very well, but the guy in the background says, that's like an animal, right? So they had no idea what they were looking at. Once we got the video, we had no idea what we were looking at. But after some research and some exploration, we discovered it was the least brook lamprey. Really interesting, really not well known species that exist along the stretches there that runs through Pearl Road. The benefit of not only knowing that they were there and getting wildlife resources out to help us document it, and getting our other staff out there to just witness it and making sure we do what we can internally to protect that. But recently, the adjacent properties to the south and to the west are going to be developed. And the developer came to us with a sewer line plan that would have run a sewer line just upslope of the stretch of stream that had the most amount of lamprey activity, where we documented their habitat as being most prevalent. I don't want to get too much into the life cycle of the lamprey, but they spend the first 3 to 4 years of their life in the substrate, kind of anchored to the gravel substrate as a filter feeders before they mature and they emerge as adults. So you can imagine any sort of sedimentation or deposition load on a substrate like that could wipe out not only that year's regeneration efforts, but maybe multiple years regeneration efforts. So it was a huge red flag for us. We were able to get wildlife resources involved. We were able to get other city departments involved, and we were able to talk the developer into rerouting that sewer line so that it doesn't threaten that stretch of stream. And to boot, they threw in several other protections, such as 75-foot buffers instead of the 50-foot buffers required for the Neuse River. They gave us different outflow options where nothing will be discharged into the creek unless it's treated for sediment first. They have different access and transportation routes that they were able to modify to better suit what we were looking for. And it's just a huge success story all the way around that would have never happened if these 2 or 3 NC State students didn't stumble across this fish in this stream. You know, or if the development would have taken place, you know, 4 or 5 years earlier, that we may have never even known they were there. So really neat story, really good case study of why we need monitoring and why we need help with it. We'll do the video one more time. Why not?
Yeah.
All right, so really quickly, I don't know how we're doing on time. I think we're okay. Some of the initiatives that the city of Raleigh and Raleigh Parks have joined recently to kind of help further our commitment to the management of natural resources. Biophilic cities is a big one. It's a worldwide initiative where they're partners with different cities from around the world. It's a commitment to the conservation of resources. There are different initiatives that we already had in place that helped us gain that I don't know if it's an accreditation or helped us gain admittance into that group of biophilic cities. Some of those you're very well familiar with. We leverage things like Lights Out as a way to help us get into that. My boss, Brian Smith, I think was speaking with the board just a few nights ago about Lights Out. And we really like to know more about how we can expand this. We are interested in getting maybe some educational materials that we can distribute. I know we have several cities in the downtown area that have committed, and I'm assuming are in practice of observing the different requirements and the timelines for Lights Out. And we've had a little bit more traction in the design phase for different properties and different facilities where we can suggest things like shades that orient the light downward instead of upward, motion sensors and timers for lights, the use of native plants especially. So different things we can do to help with that effort, but that's just one of many. We're also part of Tree City USA, which is similar to Bee City USA. It's a commitment to a certain amount of tree protection and tree planting in certain calendar periods. The Triangle Tree Initiative is a partnership with a bunch of different nonprofits that we've worked with to help plant up to 10,000 trees between last year and this year. They've donated a lot of trees for us. We've got several at the greenhouse that we're rearing up, and we put several hundred more in the ground. So really good partnerships, really good use of our public partners and their resources to help us supplement what frankly we just don't have the time, the money, and the capital for. All right, so to round us out, we talked a little bit about what things people can do to help us achieve our mission of maintaining biodiversity, monitoring biodiversity in our park system. The first bulleted list is in my mind more of like the individual efforts that people can take. They can participate in BioBlitz events. Those are really helpful. Educational programs that perhaps they can come in as a volunteer instructor. Doing simple things like collecting observations on iNaturalist, Seek, eBird. All those things then come directly to us. eBird's a little bit trickier to pull the data sometimes, but iNaturalist, we have project areas set around all of our major areas of interest. So any observation that's made inside that comes, we can pull that pretty easily. Other biological platforms, HeartMapper was something that somebody suggested to me. Does anybody have an experience using that? Is that a real thing? I put it in there. Okay, all right. It was like this afternoon, and they were like, "Oh, what about HeartMapper?" And I was like, "Sure, we'll throw it in there." I'm sure there's people here who probably have experience using it, but anything like that, we can then leverage to get more data. If you want to join a volunteer workday and come out and maybe even break a sweat, helping us to remove invasives or do other sort of habitat improvement management actions. And something I'm excited about, something I've been trying to get off the ground for a long time, is the Volunteer Ecological Monitoring Program. And y'all could probably help me come up with a catchier name for it. But the principle is to get folks who have some expertise or background in different taxa that we can then send to not only the parks and preserves that we currently have that may or may not be staffed, but some of our undeveloped properties where we really need to get a pulse on what's out there. And there's nobody really allotted to go to those sites. Right now, if we have an undeveloped property that's slated for development, I and one other person from planning typically will go out and we'll get 1 or 2 shots at these to try to inventory as much as we can to try to identify any natural resource concerns and to try to identify areas that are most and least suitable for development. What I'm pushing for is to get folks like y'all to have the permissions and the access to go to some of these sites, collect that data for us on a year-round basis if we can, establishing a network of these folks. And then not only does that help your organization, I'm assuming, accumulate volunteer hours, but that helps us with Raleigh Parks then count your efforts, typically things you may already be doing if you're going out and recording stuff on eBird, as volunteer actions on our behalf. So we can then add those to our volunteer services department totals at the end of the year, and we can use that to help leverage for more resources. So it's a win-win in a lot of situations. I just need to hammer out the final lawyer logistics of having folks come out and volunteer on the site if they're not supervised by a city parks staff member. So In the meantime, if you do go out, let's say to Horseshoe Farm or Durant or Laurel Hills or anywhere, your neighborhood park, and if you do collect a certain amount of data and you can somehow either get that to me or even just submit it through iNat or eBird, and send me an email and say, hey, I spent 3 hours at this park on this date doing this sort of monitoring or inventory. I can then get that to our volunteer services folks and we can count that as volunteer hours, something that we're missing a lot of. And we know it's happening, frequently because we see the eBird list getting updated. So as an organization, some of the things we think Wake Audubon could help with and continue to help with, I should say, because this is something that I believe you all already do, is maintain the advocacy, outreach, and education efforts that is part of your organization. Advocating for the protection of sensitive habitats, participating in public engagement processes whenever it comes to land development, rezoning issues, land use and procurement. That's something I really want to emphasize because we as natural resources do have some influence on land procurement, at least within Raleigh Parks. If there was an area that had a really high quality natural habitat or natural community, or the habitat was suitable for certain rare species, anything like that, anything of high significance that you all know about that we don't, would be great to know, because then we can then go, if that land were ever come up for sale, or if there was a chance to put an easement on that property, we would want to be able to go to our planning and development and real estate folks and say, this needs to be high up on the list whenever we are going out and buying more land. That's something that again, more eyes on the ground can only help us out with. Lastly, collaborate with us on educational materials, stuff that we can hand out and distribute, different programs, whether that's you all participating in a program or even potentially volunteering to lead one, and workshops where you basically can come and help educate our staff on different ways to observe and monitor best management practices for different species, different habitat requirements that we may or may not be familiar with. It's endless the amount of opportunities there are for organizations like Wake Audubon to come and help us. So finding the best channel, the best way to channel those efforts is something that we can work with. But until now, we were finally gearing up where we have that capacity, and we're looking forward to more of that in the future. So that wraps it up. Not sure if we want to jump right into questions or.
We do have a couple in the chat. We could start with those.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Let's see. Wow, there's more questions that I hadn't kept up with. So the first question was about how you use iNaturalist. Here we go. Is iNaturalist something that your team uses or aware of, and to help identify, track rare native plant species in the area to help improve their range space in that habitat? So are you using iNaturalist, and how are you using it with rare plants?
Yeah, so generally speaking, when the public uses iNaturalist, we do encourage them to update and send us anything. And like I mentioned earlier, we have those project areas outlined around most of our properties. Any observation made inside that property line, we can then search for and pull out indistinctly. When our staff, who are more likely those to come across the rare plants, because those are going to be in areas where the general public doesn't have access, we use a combination of iNaturalist and field maps, so ArcGIS field maps, in order for us to document that data spatially. Then yes, we do go out, we prescribe management actions to hopefully help expand whatever habitat patch that is. A good example is the big leaf magnolia at Lake Johnson. It's kind of one of those unknown origin stories, but it's still really neat and it's there, so we need to manage for it. We've noticed that the pockets are getting more and more, they're shrinking, and we're losing some of the more mature trees. So we looked at different possible fixes, and one of the ideas was just to open up a little bit more sunlight, not a lot because they don't want it to be completely open. So different things like that. We'll implement prescriptions to help expand whatever suitable habitat needs, or based on the suitable habitat needs for that species. So yeah, iNat's definitely a big tool.
Okay. Another from the chat is you were talking about the long grasses and how you're not mowing as much. The question was, doesn't that harbor rodents? They have an issue with that.
Yes, and that, in my opinion, is not a bad thing. We do have some invasive rodents, but in the areas where we're doing this, these are the more naturalized areas. So we're not observing them. We're not seeing a lot of rodents. We know they're there. We know the coyotes love them. We know that that we're improving and increasing habitat for that, but they're not typically in areas where there's a lot of high traffic with kids and pets. People are pretty particular about where they like to walk. And so anywhere that's high traffic is one of those areas we haven't had much luck in reducing the mowing. So we've conceded a certain amount of areas to allow people to walk in the short grass because it's something that they prefer, and we are a service to the public. But anywhere where we can allow the area to revegetate, or we can supplement and create those larger early successional areas, we try to keep those more or less out of the way of the public. But there's so much of what we do that we mow that's not even really in the public purview. So reducing those areas hasn't been hard. Finding those areas to reduce, I should say, has been hard. But no big problems with the rodents. Although that's just more biodiversity, right? That's something else we could probably start to monitor for.
People worry about, rats, Norway rats.
Yes.
And they see cotton rats in these meadows and they think they're a rat.
Yeah.
But they're actually a native wild species that pretty much feeds everything.
Yeah. And we have
Really
seen,
important to have.
yeah, and not only the rats, but the native voles, the moles, the mice that we found. So we've just in those areas through cover boards alone, we've been able to pick those things out that wouldn't have been hanging out in other places. So yeah, we will keep an eye out for any sort of invasive wildlife like that. But the idea that habitat is not only good for the rodents, but several other suites of wildlife that justifies that.
There's a couple more questions, but I'm sure we've got some questions in the room too. When we go back to the chat. Anyone?
I have a question about private homeowners, and I'll have to use myself as an example. I do part of the field watch, and that all goes to Cornell. It is not part of eBird. I live between the Greenway and the park. Is that something that would be of value to you all?
I think so, absolutely. Yeah, feeder watch is not something.
Repeat the question, please.
Yeah, just.
Oh,
For the Zoom folks.
Yep. Okay. So the question was, feeder watch, did I have that right? Is another sort of thing, I'm assuming like Nest Watch, where members of the public can sign up and then submit observations of things that they've seen around their feeders. I haven't delved into that too much myself. I think that's something that we could definitely use, and maybe even explore more, similar to iNet, where we were able to create interest areas. So observations like that were automatically searchable, and that would save you the step of having to email us your own findings. But even if it's a emailed list of what you saw that day, I will take whatever, because we have finally areas set up to where I can move that data over. And while we may not use it immediately, we now have it. And so when we go back and we try to run these bigger compilations, we have that much more data to squeeze into it and come out with a better product in the long run. So feeder watch is definitely something I'm gonna look more into. We do have Nest Watch volunteers. We have several Wake Audubon members who are Nest Watch volunteers that monitor our bluebird boxes. But feeder watch sounds cool, so I'm gonna have to look into that.
So you mentioned that deer, we have so many deer in our parks, and I can't imagine in the city of Raleigh that we would ever hunt the deer, and it would be a controversial decision, even though it does happen in some places. So if we're trying to protect some plants here, what are our options? I guess, fencing areas to protect them. But we don't do that too much, not yet anyway. I've seen Brian England do it a little bit.
Yeah, so
I mean, is that something that you're considering doing?
you're trying to get me in trouble, John. Disclaimer, yeah, hunting in Raleigh Parks is something that's definitely been third rail for a long time. But you look at Charlotte Mecklenburg, their park system, which is very high in terms of their reputation. They do hunts. And I had a chance to sit down and speak with their nature preserve manager. And he talked about how successful they were just after a couple years of very selective hunting. That's something we would really have to hammer out. It would be probably confined to several parks that are on the outskirts. But I, for one, and this is speaking personally, I see the value in that, and I would advocate for that if it ever came down the road. In the meantime, the fencing that you mentioned has proven to be pretty successful, especially at Wilkerson. where Brian has, and it really helps that he's excellent in botany, right? He's able to see sprigs that come up that if he were to wait and for them to mature to be able to get, you know, 100% ID, they would be gone. You know, those new shoots would be browsed and he would never have a chance. He's been able to gamble on a few of those that have come up, and he's set fencing about 5 or 6 feet high. It's the big square grid fencing, and he encloses groups of plants, or sometimes the fencing is a little smaller if it's just an individual, and that keeps the deer from being able to browse it. And he's been able to not only preserve several different rare species, but actually encourage like the propagation and spread to where he's had to expand his enclosures. The problem we're running into now there is it's a proven technique, but it's not sustainable. You can't continue to fence everything in. So we've looked at fencing the entire boundary in. That's going to be difficult. It's adjacent to Falls Lake, right there off the southeast corner. So we have ingress and egress frequently from deer. So it's a tough sell to do anything more than fencing now. I'd like to explore deterrence. I know people use dryer sheets and stuff if it's specific plants. The folks down in Charlotte, Mecklenburg use a little bit of diesel fuel inside this little bottle with a wick, and apparently that is extremely effective. So where the dryer sheets don't look great, you have a bunch of dryer sheets hanging off of plants and saplings. That might be a potential option. Nobody likes the idea of putting diesel fuel out anywhere, but so we are exploring different deterrent methods. For now, fencing is something that we are expanding use of in other sites. And maybe one day we'll be able to talk and have that debate about hunting, which I think would be valuable.
You know, years ago, when I worked at Durant, I mean, ovenbirds was a common nesting species, but I don't believe they nest there anymore. And I really think it has to do with deer. And they have just browsed so much of the understory today. And I mean, it'd be interesting to see if you fenced off some areas within the greater habitat and just let some understory grow, you know, with things like other birds come back.
Yeah, so that's interesting. The question or the comment was about ovenbirds that used to persist at Durant Nature Preserve and now are scarce or absent totally, and whether or not we could fence off large areas to help preserve that habitat, to protect it from deer browse, to provide that understory that they like. That's something we'd definitely be interested in. And we've done some experimental type plots where we have some plots that are just fenced, some plots that are fenced and burned, some plots that are fenced and mowed, but these are really small. These are, you know, 10th acre plots that we're basically toying around with. Habitat patch size is something that comes to mind. So looking at what a species like that would need, and if that's feasible, our nature preserves would be a good spot to explore that. Nature preserves are a little different from the other parks in that they have that designation. We're currently working on expanding that designation to more properties, whether it's nature preserve or protected areas. So we'll have a little bit more in that system, and then we can look at maybe implementing those more novel techniques there too. So
There's a couple of mammal questions in here, so let's put them
Yeah,
together. One
okay.
question was about how red foxes are being managed.
Okay.
Are there gray foxes here too?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, and coyotes, whether there's an increase in coyotes and if there's anything you all are doing to manage for that.
Yeah, so as far as the red foxes go, we do have sort of this be on the lookout. If we don't see them very often, but if we find them, we typically will report them to wildlife resources. I know the conservation biologist there and the regional biologist, we just typically give them a heads up. This is where it was, this is where it's found. Coyotes, aside from maybe catching them on camera traps every now and then, there's not much we're doing for them. We're certainly not doing any trapping for those larger mammals. Gray foxes we do have, and we try to encourage them where we can. We do have some dens in several of our sites, and we've set up trail cameras. In fact, I wonder if I can go back and show you this cute little guy. He looks like a red fox, but he's a gray fox. There he is. That's at Lake Johnson. So we put a trail cam right outside the den, and he popped out one day and got his picture taken. So in terms of active management, not really, it's more passive management. If we do have nuisance issues, that's where we bring in wildlife resources, and sometimes even animal control. If we have had the occasional rabbit raccoon, not recently, but in the past, probably before my time. I think there was one since I've been here. But yeah, we're not really actively controlling coyote or red fox populations.
And then, there was another one about possum specifically, but are you interested in partnering with rehabbers to provide release sites for helping animals?
Yeah, I could see that being, definitely worth the discussion. Reintroductions of any kind, whether it's plant or animal, is something that we always at least want to be very cautious about. So depending on, where the animal's from, what kind of conditions it's in, what kind of care it's received, I don't see why that would be out of the question. We do have people constantly dumping squirrels and baby ducks and I mean, on top of cats and dogs, but other wildlife that they've discovered. They want to do the right thing, and so they bring it to the nature preserve of the park and they let it go. And then one of our staff will stumble across it. There's the albino king snake, California king snake, that was found at Wilkerson, that is now on display there. It's another good example of people bringing and releasing. So it happens whether we like it or not, but we would be interested in looking at more controlled releases if we were able to kind of hammer out the details, making sure we're not going to cause more damage than good with those reintroductions.
Are there other questions in the room?
How about invasive plant species on private property?
Yeah, so that's another tricky one. We have several, we have more than several, we have hundreds of examples where we have encroachment of invasives from private property to our property. In that situation, we can manage everything up to the property line that's on Parks site. Anything beyond that, we can send a nice letter and say, hey, please be aware that this is in your yard. These are the problems it can create. That's when we don't have a lot of interest from the landowner. We do have several landowners who have approached us and said, hey, I've got bamboo that spills over from my yard into the park. What can you do to help me? In the past, the best we've been able to do is secure a right of entry agreement with the landowner. We can come in and we can cut what's on our property to the best of our knowledge and try to remove as much of that as we can. Lake Johnson has a big bamboo patch on the north side. It's a really good example. Landowner contacted us and let us come in and out of her yard. We were able to get a chipper down there. We were able to do a lot more work than if we were to try to come in through the park and up the greenway, because that would have just been really bad in terms of access. So whenever a neighbor or citizen reaches out, we try our best to work with them, whether it's getting out there and managing everything up to our line, pointing them to the right resources and even a list of potential contractors, somebody they can contact to come out and handle the stuff on their site. And then we try to create more public outreach, educational materials, stuff that we can put signage out. Lake Johnson, I use Lake Johnson as a lot of examples because it's got a lot of pressure on it. There's a stretch on the eastern side of that park where it's completely invaded with privet, with autumn olive, with dozens of other non-native plants. Several of them you wouldn't expect to find, but then you realize people are just taking their yard clippings over there. And after years, we have like full-on established native or invasive populations of plants that we're year after year trying to whittle down. And it's all because these folks, instead of disposing of their clippings somewhere, they took it and threw it into the park side. So the education piece, the cooperation piece where the landowners are willing, that's about the best we can do for now. And we're seeing more of that, which is encouraging, right? More people reaching out to us about invasives.
And then stuff like, so I live right here downtown. We've got not sure exactly how to get rid of it.
Yeah, kudzu's a tricky one. Kudzu's one of those where a lot of people want to pull the nuclear option, a lot of herbicide, and just really kind of hammer it, get it down to like a maintenance phase. We have kudzu in a lot of our greenway areas, especially, that we're trying to figure out. For now, our management is kind of targeted to areas where we have unique natural communities or specific species that we're trying to preserve. But yeah, kudzu is one of those that whenever you see this giant landscape and it's just covered in this thing, it's so disheartening. But chipping away is the best advice I can give you. Some people have a lot of success with goats. I did when I was with state parks. We did a project up in the mountains where we used goats, and that was fantastic. But it's not as easy as it sounds. There's a lot of considerations for what else is growing there, getting somebody to bring goats to the property. So exciting thing we're doing is working with USDA and APHIS to release biocontrol options. So I think it's a cichlid, maybe it's a beetle. I'm sorry, I can't remember. I didn't research this before we came out, but we've worked with them before to do trial releases. not only for kudzu, but also for Japanese knotweed. We almost got them to come out to do wasp releases for emerald ash borer, but that was right when COVID hit. So we're exploring different options like that, not only for our own benefit, but to help us inform people who call us with those same questions. You know, kudzu is a nasty, it's a beast, man. It's a multi-year investment, that's for sure.
The questions will just keep coming, so we'll cut it off. We'll say
Yeah.
two more questions from the Zoom land. So one of the questions we often get, so you talked about how you were able to influence that development where the lampreys are. What do you suggest we do when we see habitat destruction or development that we have a concern about?
Yeah, so this is another issue that I wouldn't have thought it would be as thorny as it's turned out to be sometimes. We as Raleigh Parks, I think we see eye to eye with Wake Audubon and a lot of conservation organizations on the need to manage and the need to protect. But we are limited in our role as being part of that government to advocate or take sides one way or the other. If Wake Audubon or if members notice something like that, sending us an email would be really kind of the first step, kind of a quick like, hey, this is happening. Can you come out and take a look at it? From there, we can then direct that to, let's say it's owned by transportation or Raleigh Water. We can then direct that request to somebody who's overseeing that property, in which case in the past, sometimes they've reached back out to us and said, okay, cool. Will you go check it out for us? And then us as a natural resource section will go and follow up on that. The most infamous example is probably the Anderson Point sewer line, where we were not doing our due diligence in terms of monitoring those ephemeral pools. Raleigh Water had a sewer line expansion that came through, and thankfully we had people like John Connors who sent us an email and said, hey, are you aware of this happening? That was the first natural resources that heard about it. So we then had to jump in with Raleigh Water, and it put us in almost not quite an adversarial position with Raleigh Water, but there was conflicting interest there. You know, our priority was protecting these pools in the riparian area that flows along the Neuse. Their priority was putting in the new sewer line, which is something we understand has to be done. Now that we're aware of it, we're trying to get out there and monitor it more frequently. We're trying to encourage them when they do reseed to use native plants, something that's going to be really important because it's a large area that they're disturbing, and then do what we can to maybe foster the return of those pools. According to the contract, they're supposed to return everything to grade as is. We'll see how that goes. But that's a prime example of where communication within the city failed, and somebody from the community stepped up and helped us at least get on board midstream, even if it wasn't as early as we would have liked. So yeah, please feel free to reach out to us. There's nothing, the worst we could do is say, I'm sorry, that's another city department's property. Let us put you in contact with somebody over there.
I think that's the questions with general appeals. There is one other question I'll ask you to answer offline, but anyone else in the room? Okay. What's that?
I said they're doing a good job, yes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
the Zoom folks are on it tonight.
That's good. Yeah.
An engaged crowd of about.
It's better than
30 folks out there.
crickets. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. So I will go ahead and shut this down.
She'll say goodbye and
Yeah, so we really appreciate you coming, first of
Yeah,
all.
no problem. Yeah, I appreciate the invite. It was exciting. I've got another presentation this Thursday at the Invasive Plant Council. So this was good prep. I used to do public speaking a lot, especially with soil and water. Haven't done it in a while. So this was a good reentry back into that
Yeah, well,
with
in
a comfortable crowd. You know.
yeah. So you weren't here last month, but in addition to working with John on the issue you just talked about, and us on Horseshoe Farms, we've done a lot of work with Sean, so we're grateful to finally get you in here to talk to us.
Yeah, happy to do it. Yeah, we can do it again. We can make it a recurring thing.
Sure.
Would you like to connect?
Yeah, I'll just go ahead and real quick, since your computer is up. Primarily for the folks in the room, but for folks who may want to come to the December meeting, Lena has donated 3 items that are in the back for previewing this evening. a really nice decorative birdhouse that might make a very nice holiday gift. A pelican case that is perfect for camera equipment. So if you're looking for something like that, it's only been used once, right? Yeah, I mean, it's a really nice pelican case. You could probably fit like a tablet in there even. It's pretty good size. Not huge, but you could fit a tablet in there. And then a brand new Peterson book. Tell me the name of the book, please, Diane. Bird behavior. By Kirshner? Yeah, part of the Peterson series, I guess we would say. Yeah, so encourage everyone to come out next month to try your hand at winning one of those. Winning through paycheck. Bring your credit card, well, not your credit card, bring your checkbook, I guess, or cash. But please do come out for the December meeting, whether that's in person or online. That's when we're going to vote for our officers and board of directors for 2024. And we need to hear from you on that. And John's got something, and then we'll part.
Speaking of December, we've invited, I've invited a colleague up. It's Kate Sutherland. She's a seabird biologist, and she's mostly been a co-leader of the seabird trips off the coast of North Carolina for the last 15, 20 years. She takes great photographs, did a little research with some of our specimens, including the black-capped petrel. She'll talk about that, but I asked her to show some of her great photos of the seabirds off the coast of North Carolina. So she'll be our December speaker, and she's going to be driving all the way up from Hatteras. So hopefully a bunch of you will be able to make it out and welcome her to Raleigh. Anything else, Mary? All right, that's it. The rest of us are going to go in the bag and have some snacks. And thanks again for joining us, and we'll see you next time.